Hey everybody, it's me, Hugh from that channel, and I'm here with Olivier Wagner and from 1040 Abroad. And this is the 1040 Abroad show, really intended for dual citizens.
Right. Absolutely. I prepare tax returns for Americans who live overseas. And a recurring question I have, especially from accidental Americans, but anybody who has a second citizenship, is whether they should give up their US citizenship because at some point the cost might outweigh the benefits.
Yeah, it's crazy that you'd think America, which was the go-to country, the country that everybody wanted to, the shining city atop a hill, has now become a country where people who were actually born there are thinking that they need to forego their citizenship.
It's quite curious. I get a lot of traffic from the United States to my website for people who I guess will never become clients. But like you get in the news, all these people who try to immigrate successfully or not to the United States. And at the same time, you have US citizens who consider giving up their US citizenship. And the US has citizenship-based taxation. If you're a US citizen, you have to file a tax return with the US. The law has been in place since the Civil War, but the enforcement has really picked up over the past decade or two.
Mm-hmm.
And that's if you open a bank account anywhere in the world, except the US, of course, the bank will ask you whether you're a US citizen or not. And if you are, they will forward your information to the IRS, which means that they will match it with your tax return, and you should have one on file to make sure that there's no penalties and stuff. So that's an obligation that all US citizens have. And if your income is mostly from wages, especially if you live in a country with an higher tax rate, it might not be as much of an issue. But there are situations where that would be more of an issue.
Mm. So I mean, it's so we're in Canada, and I guess we don't have that. We don't have citizen-based taxation.
Right, that's correct. Canada and most developed countries have residency-based taxation. So if you leave Canada, you will no longer be a Canadian tax resident.
Mm-hmm.
You need to leave it for good. You need to sever your ties with Canada, have new ties elsewhere. If you just go on an around the world trip, you might not have enough ties elsewhere to convince the CRA. But point is, if you actually left Canada, even if you're a Canadian citizen, you would stop being a Canadian tax resident,
mm-hmm.
and you would only be taxed on your Canadian sourced income, most likely zero. Whereas a US citizen, even if they don't have any US sourced income, would have to report their worldwide income. There are ways not to pay actual tax. That's the craziest thing, is that it's the compliance requirements. It's having to pay their accountants to prepare the forms that often drives them to give up their citizenship about as much as the actual cost of paying tax to the US.
You mean sort of the red tape involved? Is that it?
Yes, exactly.
Is that what it is?
Yes.
Okay. And you yourself, just to give people a little background, so 1040abroad.com is your website for
Yes.
your accounting business, right? And you're an accountant?
Yeah, that's yes, I am. I started out French. I moved to the US in 2005.
Yeah.
I moved to Montreal in 2011. I traveled a bit from 2015 to 2018. Moved back to Toronto in 2018. And I worked in finance in New York, and I became an enrolled agent and a CPA, created 1040 Abroad when I moved to Montreal. So I've been operating 1040 abroad in some fashion or another since 2012. And I prepare tax returns for Americans who live overseas. I've been partnering with John Richardson since 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And he's an attorney who's mostly taking care of the immigration side of giving up US citizenship. So we have a good synergy, but I've been focusing on people who give up US citizenship for the past 6 years now.
Mm-hmm. Which is a growing business, I guess. More and more people are giving up their US citizenship, do you think?
Yes. In 2012, when I started, I had one such client, and it was a curiosity almost.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of people who give up US citizenship just keeps on increasing, and that has been driven mostly because of these bank reporting requirements.
Sorry, what are they? The bank reporting,
right, FATCA.
which was a new.
Well, it started in 2011.
Okay.
And at first, banks had to look through their records to see whether they had any indicia of US citizenship. If the balance was more than $50,000, they had to look more carefully. So if they had a client with a US place of birth, there was a presumption that that person was American. But people who didn't have indicia might have fallen through the cracks in 2011. But since then, as I mentioned, if you open a bank account, the bank will ask you whether you're a US citizen, and you could face penalties if you lie. I mean, specifically, the terms and conditions will say that if you lie and the US government fines the bank, you will have to reimburse the bank.
Mm-hmm.
And the IRS will receive that information and then try to match it with the US tax return.
Do you think, for dual American citizens or Americans living abroad, do you think most of them are aware of FATCA and these reporting requirements?
Well, they might not be aware of the technicalities of it, but once they receive a letter from their bank asking whether they're a US citizen or not,
Mm-hmm.
they start questioning the implication. They go on Google, they do their research, and then they go down the rabbit hole. They're like, should I file my tax return and file it every year? Or should I just give up my US citizenship and I would have to file 5 years of returns, granted, but then I wouldn't have to file any going forward. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. That's the criterions that will drive that decision. And the way I see it, the main benefit of US citizenship is the ability to live and work in the US. So if you're in your 20s or 30s, you don't really have ties in Canada, you want to be open to pursuing a career in the US, retaining US citizenship makes complete sense because you can go there and work without any notice, really. As people get older, they have more ties with Canada or their home country. And as they get closer to retirement, they get more investment income, which comes with its own set of tax complications. Drives up the cost of preparing the tax returns. In some instances, might actually mean that they would owe tax to the US. And then as they get older, they might be more inclined to give up US citizenship. And it's also a very personal decision. There's obviously tax implication, but it's a sense of identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And ironically enough, it's even more so for people like myself who naturalized as US citizens, who adds more invested in becoming a US citizen than people who were born with both, who might identify as US citizen or not, but they didn't have the same emotional attachment, the same work to get it in the first place. Another criterion might be if you have another family member who's a US citizen. If I have a couple, they're married, they're both US citizens, you could have one spouse who has most of the assets, give up US citizenship, stop having to file US tax returns. The other one would still be in a position to sponsor the other spouse for a green card, should they actually want to move to the US. It's crazy. You can go through the whole circle of, giving up US citizenship, going for the green card, and maybe applying for it again.
I'm just thinking too, there are a lot of Canadians that maybe by pure accident they were born in the US.
Yes, exactly.
And their parents are in Canada, but now all of a sudden, do they would also have these tax implications?
Oh, yes, exactly. They're referred to as accidental Americans, and they're the largest group that would be in this situation. So you might have Canadian citizens who went to the States to study for a year or two, and
somebody got pregnant.
Exactly. And so they give birth in the US, and the kid is American and Canadian as well, from birth. But the kid will have to file US tax returns for the rest of his life.
Now, for those people, it might be an easier decision, maybe to give up their American citizenship just because they're not really American. They don't have any.
Right. Exactly. They don't have as much ties emotionally or otherwise with the US. That's correct.
But still, just to think you were accidentally born in the US and now all of a sudden you've got to go through some paperwork, I would imagine,
Right.
to renounce your US citizenship.
Right. If you are to renounce, you need to have 5 years of tax returns on file.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you go through the process with the consulate to renounce, and you will file the final tax return. If you, there are several criteria that will make you a so-called covered expatriate.
Mhm.
If you have an average tax liability of $470,000, if you didn't file these 5 years of returns. But the main one is if you have a net wealth of more than $2 million. Then you will be a covered expatriate and you will have to pay an exit tax, which will be a deemed disposition of all of your assets. But that means that on the day you renounce, it will be as if you sold all of your assets. And if you have unrealized capital gains, you will have to pay tax on that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing. If you get close to the $2 million mark, that might be a good time to renounce so that you will not be subject to the exit tax.
Wow. So there's a lot of things to consider, really. And I guess it would depend on your circumstances, obviously. You know,
Right.
where are you living now? Where are you from originally? But so let's talk about some of the considerations, some of the other considerations for people out there who it might be to their advantage to give up the U.S. citizenship or not. But
Right.
what are some of the other factors that people might want to think about?
Well, again, it's like the complexity of your tax return, the possibility that you might have tax owing. The sale of principal residence is tax-free in Canada. Was in
For
the
now.
Yes, for now. That's insane. Like, I just keep on seeing the price of real estate going up and up, and even like 5 years ago, I was like, that cannot continue. That makes no sense.
Yeah.
But yes, you're right. If they place that tax to cool it off, that then these dual citizens would have a foreign tax credit because they pay tax to Canada and they would get a dollar for dollar credit to the US, which they do not have right now, because if you don't pay tax elsewhere, you don't have a foreign tax credit.
Mm-hmm.
So, right. So if you lived in that place for at least 2 years, you will get a $250,000 exemption on your capital gain on the US side, which is nice. But, you know, like condos downtown Toronto go for like a couple $1 million now. So the $250,000, depending on when you bought it, might be exhausted fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't have the foreign tax credit, as you mentioned, because you won't pay tax to Canada. So you might want to give up your US citizenship before you sell that condo.
Mm-hmm. Now, are you finding that, because we're in the COVID situation now, right?
Right.
Is this having an impact on
yes.
people's decision whether to give up the U.S.? I mean, right now, I almost want to move to some of those states where they don't have a lockdown. I've never really wanted to live in the States before,
Right.
but right now things in Ontario are counter, I don't know what the word is, but I'd rather live a little bit more free. Like
Right. And as a US citizen, you can enter the US by land. As a Canadian, you can only go there by air.
You can only go there by air now?
Yeah.
Is that it?
I mean,
Really?
unless you're an essential worker, obviously.
Oh, okay.
But if you can always travel to the US for leisure. You need to have a negative COVID test, and you will need to fly there.
Right.
As a Canadian, as a US citizen, you can go there by land. Point is, the COVID situation has been improving a lot. And I read the other day that everybody who wants to be vaccinated in Louisiana, and to a lesser extent other southern states, has already been vaccinated. So now they're trying to push people, and it's fairly easy to get the vaccine there, whereas we're still trying to figure it out here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, only about 30% of the population in Louisiana wanted to be vaccinated.
Mm.
So now they're trying to convince people to get up to that 70%, right? But, right, back to the renunciation topic, the consulates were closed from March to August last year. And people who had appointments to renounce US citizenship during this time had their appointments cancelled. And only now are they rescheduling those appointments. And so if someone wants to renounce now, and they were to schedule an appointment with the US consulate, they would get at the back of the queue. And what I've been telling my clients, we're in April, and I'm not sure whether they'll be able to get an appointment in 2021. So, yeah, that's there was always a delay, some waiting wait list. But the COVID situation and the consulate closures have exacerbated that, and now I expect a wait time of about 6 months, but I cannot guarantee it.
No, sorry, this is for the citizenship. Sorry, what's this the wait time for? I'm just
Right. Absolutely. That's if someone wants to give up their US citizenship,
right.
They would contact the consulate to schedule an appointment.
So this has been delayed now, and that could have serious financial implications, right?
Right. Again, if we take the example of that person who wants to give up their citizenship before they sell the condo, well, that will delay the time they can sell the condo because they would be paying tax on the capital gains to the US if they were to sell it while they were still US citizens.
So, okay. So, we've mentioned a few different factors, right? Age being one of them, your financial situation being another one. What else?
I mean, what your other citizenship is. If you're Canadian, a Canadian passport is... aside from the ability to move to the States, a Canadian passport gives you the same benefits as the US passport. Was if your other citizenship was Mexican,
right.
that it's a fairly good Mexico. I love the country. It's a great second world country. But you cannot travel freely to as many places as you would with a US passport. Right. So if you're Mexican and a US citizen, chances are that you would have to apply for a visa to go places. You'll probably get it, but that's an inconvenience you would have to go through every time you want to go to Europe or other places.
I'm just thinking though. So is it? I'm just thinking about maybe Americans living in maybe a place like Russia or China or maybe some place that isn't so friendly with the US, or are these countries also obligated to the US to forward all the banking information? Because I could see a country saying, I'm not going to deal with, I don't care what the US law is. We're just not going to play that game.
Well, that's the thing. Essentially, any bank in the world wants to have the ability to perform international wire transfers in US dollars.
Right.
And that means they need to have a correspondent account in the US, and the US was threatening to withhold the 30% tax on any such transfers that a non-compliant bank would have.
I see.
And so when it started in 2011, there was this question as to people would actually abide, but it's not really that they wanted to, it's that they didn't really have a choice. And so FATCA got implemented, and I think aside from Cuba, I mean, if you have a bank account in North Korea, you have other problems, but
do they even have banks? Do they even need banks in North Korea?
Well, I read that they have this debit card for tourists that you can open, but like the loss of principle is a real possibility with these things. It will be a great novelty item, but you cannot travel there anymore anyway.
Well, it's too bad. Trump was president and relations with North Korea were heating up. It was great.
Right.
Now, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, we never know with them. But so essentially all banks got compliant with FATCA. I mean, there are some small exemptions every year and then that were granted as these agreements were signed. And then the OECD started, since FATCA passed and all of these banks were compliant, the OECD had its own template called GATCA, where they ask anybody where they're a tax resident and they would send information to that country, provided it's an OECD member country. And that's the interesting thing. The US didn't sign GATCA because they already got what they needed from FATCA, and they were powerful enough to say no. And so, like, they had this huge crackdown against tax havens, and now the US is like the largest tax haven out there. So that's
what do you mean by that? That the US is the largest tax haven?
Oh, if you want to open an LLC in Delaware or Wyoming, you can easily do that online. You find a registered agent, and your name would not be a public record. So you would act as your LLC, and people wouldn't know who the person behind it is. And of course, you can open a US bank account for your US LLC, and that US bank will not be sharing your information with Canada or your European country.
Boy, that sounds like it could be a whole other show just to talk about that.
Oh yeah,
because I think you might be piquing a lot of people's interests right now with that.
Sure. That's not what I do. That's just something I'm aware of. I have sometimes a personal curiosity around that, and that touches upon the things I do. But obviously, you can open an LLC in the US. There's nothing illegal about that. You can open a bank account for your LLC in the US, but you need to report it to Canada, for instance. If you have more than $100,000 in foreign assets, you have to include Form T1135 with your Canadian tax return. So these activities are legal as long as you disclose them as you're supposed to your foreign country. The issue is that if you don't disclose it as you're supposed to, the CRA in this case might not have the tools to enforce it because they won't know that you own the LLC in the first place.
I guess we'll have to cut this part of the interview out. Just kidding.
Sure.
Okay, so I mean, do you have any idea about the size of the or how many, say, dual citizens U.S. There are in Canada, and then maybe around the world?
I think there's about 9 million around the world. There's maybe 1 or 2 in Canada. I think
1 or 2 million?
Millions. Yes.
Really? Wow. That's. I mean, that's a big number.
Yes.
Really.
Yes, it is. Yes. I mean, we were discussing it just earlier. Before the 1960s, there was no real public healthcare insurance in Canada the way there is now. And so, and obviously people in Canada live close to the border because the northern parts gets easily frozen. And so back then, when, you have to pay out of pocket regardless, and the prices were more reasonable than they are now, some people would just go to an hospital in the US without really thinking about the consequence of their child being a US citizen, or they might actually have welcomed it. And now, as this turn of events has happened, this US citizenship is less desirable.
And what percentage, say, of the Canadians that are in this circumstance of being dual citizens with the US don't know anything about these tax implications?
I estimate that maybe a quarter of them are tax compliant. And I cannot speculate for the other 75% whether they're not compliant by choice or because they don't know.
Yeah, right. So this is something anybody watching this right now, and you're a dual citizen, and whether you're in Canada or anywhere in the world, US and some other kind of citizenship, unless you know that you're compliant, you could be subject to some serious financial implications. And this is where you come in, right? And Olivier, I know you're based here in Toronto, at least currently. But,
yes.
Can you work with people anywhere in the world?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I work online. I was working online before COVID-19. I didn't have to change anything. Right, so we can schedule a call on Zoom, and else we communicate by email. I create a secured account on my portal that's using the same encryption as banking websites. And my clients would upload the documents there. I would prepare the returns within 2 weeks, and then they would file it.
So, I mean, what's the worst case scenario if somebody doesn't comply and maybe they owe a lot of money or something? And I mean, what is the worst implicated? They can't go back to the U.S., or is it get even worse than that? Could they get kidnapped? And
well, there's no. You can always go back to the U.S. as a U.S. citizen. If you owe more than $50,000, they can cancel your US passport or refuse to issue one. But even in these circumstances, they'll still issue you a limited validity passport that's only valid to go to the US. And then if you don't have another citizenship, you're stuck there. But so you can always go to the US as a US citizen. There's a common misconception that it wasn't your question, but it's related. There's a law that says that people who give up US citizenship for the purpose of avoiding to pay US tax cannot go back to the US.
that is a law.
That's a law, but
Okay.
There's never been an exchange of information between the Department of State and the IRS to implement it. It has been in the books since the 1990s. And out of the thousands of people who were announced, maybe a dozen have been unable to go to the US as a result of it. And it was always because either at the consulate or when entering the US, they said that they were announced to avoid paying US tax. And oftentimes it's not even the case. Oftentimes they were announced to avoid having to pay their accountants to complete all of these tax forms. It's not even the amount of tax owing per se that drive them to announce. It's all of this red tape that's associated with being a US citizen that drives them to announce. Or having to manage their financial affairs such that they don't have to pay US tax. Was they could invest in a TFSA if they were not a US citizen. They can still if they're a US citizen, but it's not tax-free in the US. That completely defeats the purpose.
Oh, I see.
So that they, again, it's not really the cost of tax, it's the cost of filing the tax return or the restrictions on the way they can manage their affairs that drives them to announce. So that's called the Weed Amendment that says that if you give up US citizenship to avoid paying tax to the US, you cannot go back to the US. It has seldom been used. Aside from that, to fail to file tax returns, there's these huge penalties that are sometimes assessed. And please contact me. Please go on my website, contact me, tell me what your situation is, and I'll tell you whether it's a penalty that's likely to be assessed or that's a penalty that's almost never assessed. But the FBAR penalty, the maximum if you willfully fail to disclose a foreign bank account, is 50% of the account balance per year. They can go back 6 years. So normally that would be 300%. But like a year or two ago, they came back and they were so nice to say that they will only take all of your money.
All of it.
As opposed to 300% of it. That was that was really generous on their part. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that they haven't really enforced it too much.
Right. The FBAR penalty is not enforced that often. So that's a form I would complete without too much concern to have a wisdom cause. If you have a foreign corporation, we'll have to file Form 5471. That will be a form and the associated penalty that will need to be considered more carefully. But again, if you're concerned of penalties, contact me. And whether it's me or John Richardson, we're really trying to have our clients' best interest in mind and have a practical approach and say, this penalty is assessed. We really should proceed carefully. Or I know this penalty is in the books, but you won't have to pay it because it's seldom assessed. I know a lot of my competitors are, even if they know or should know that the penalty will not really be assessed by the IRS, they use their fear-mongering tactics to scare clients and push them into paying higher fees, paying more tax, to Yeah, because it's in their best interest to sell more fees. And if you have a client in a situation of fear, they'll be more able to agree to anything. And that's something that John Richardson and myself try to really not do, and really have our clients' best interest in mind.
And and you guys are both American citizens.
Yes.
Or you're dual, both of you. So you're both in
Yes.
the situation of having to deal with all that.
Yes, absolutely.
Bureaucracy and you're both accountants, right?
He's an attorney, but yeah, same thing.
Well, it's good to have that on the team as well.
Right, exactly. Yes.
It's almost like, because, according to what you said, there could be up to 3/4 of the people out there that need your services don't even know it.
Right, exactly.
So anybody that has American and dual citizenship with any other country, they should probably, but maybe this is the first time they're hearing about this, but it sounds like even if they just come and talk to you, you can kind of at least explain the situation to them, kind of explain the lay of the land and help them kind of make the right decisions going forward, and probably optimize their the financial situation or the implications for them. Is there anything else that you want to let people know about today? And hopefully we're going to have a continuing series of these conversations, but anything else you just want to let people know about?
No, I think we touched upon everything I wanted to discuss today. Thank you.
Okay, so we got the website down. Where is it? Right there. 1040 Abroad. You just go to the website and they can...
Right, I have a contact form there. Simply fill it out, tell us what your concern is, what your situation is, and we'll get back to you.
Okay, Olivier. Great.
Thank you.
Great to have this conversation, and look forward to having some more. So we'll see you next time.
Definitely.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time on 1040 Abroad. Cheers.